Hey everyone, we got a special episode this week. We had a chance a while back to speak to the Jews at Microsoft group, and we were able to tell our story of how the podcast was founded, talk about some of our favorite movies, some common themes that came up, and do a little Q&A at the end. So enjoy this special episode, and we'll be back with another regular episode in 2 weeks. Thanks for coming today to our discussion called Exploring Jewish Identity Through Film, a discussion on creating artistic Jewish multimedia content. Fun fact, ChatGPT kind of helped out with that title, so shout out to AI right up top. My name is Daniel Zana. I'm a video editor, producer with a background in documentary, music videos, and reality TV. I'm originally from California. I spent about 11 years in New York, and now I'm in Seattle. With me, as always, is my amazing co-host, Harry.
Hey everyone, thanks for having us on here. As Daniel just mentioned, I'm the co-host. I am Harry Adensasser. I am originally from New York, or New Jersey, New York. I moved out to Seattle for about a year. That's kind of where I crossed paths with Daniel. I'll tell that story soon. And I am currently working as a business analyst. I do have a background. I was a film studies major, kind of got my interest peaked in film, but that's just kind of the context for me being a part of this podcast. So I tease this, but I will tell the story of kind of how this podcast came together. So as I just mentioned, I was out in Seattle for about a year. I was on a job out there, and I was introduced to Seattle to Daniel very early on. We attended the same shul community, so we kind of got to know each other there. But the first time we were introduced to each other, it was probably only a couple weeks after I had moved, and I kind of made it my brand a little bit that I was, had this film background. I was excited to talk about film with anyone who would listen. And, that brought Daniel to me. And he almost immediately after introducing himself kind of pitched me on this podcast to join his Jewish life with his film life. I was the perfect partner. I would come together. And if I'm being completely honest, I'll have to admit that I was kind of nodding along with the, I didn't want to be rude. This was my first, I was leaving my first impression on a new friend, but didn't actually think that I was going to become a podcaster. Didn't think that, either of us would follow up on this and it would just be kind of a fun first conversation and we would just move on with our lives. But Daniel was pretty committed to it. I later learned that he had a bit of a background with podcasts, with editing and all the sort that he'll get into. But he followed up with me a couple nights later. We did our first recording together. We chose the movie Uncut Gems that we both liked. We decided to just hit record over Zoom, go back and forth for about an hour. And that episode is actually published to our feed. It's not the very first, but it's one of the first couple that we posted. And if you want to go back and listen to that early conversation, but I will warn you, I think we've gotten a lot better since that first one and kind of figured out the tone of the pod since then. But that was kind of just how it started, just because we wanted to put it together and pulled it off.
I did not know that. Good to know. Yeah, shout out to Merkaz Seattle, a modern Orthodox synagogue. I always felt like, with my background, I'd done a lot of projects in the creative side and I've done some Jewish stuff, but like I'd always feel that they were very different things. Like, I'd be working on a reality show and I need to export a cut for the network executives, but it's like Friday afternoon and I'm looking at the clock and it's somewhat like the jazz singer where I'm trying to compare like, playing piano to doing like Yom Kippur services and things like that. So I always felt that they were very disparate things, but I do feel like now with the podcast, it's kind of melding the two worlds into one, and it's been really great so far. Yeah. So what exactly is Jews on Film? For those not familiar, it's a podcast that we do where we discuss something. We discuss a movie with a guest. They release every 2 weeks now, and each episode is based on a different film. We have a guest, and we often try to pair the guest with the movie. So, for instance, in this particular slide, we have Josh Weiss, who's an author, and he has a book out that's about a 1950s detective, film noir style detective that has communists and Hollywood and intrigue and espionage and all that good stuff. So we thought like Hail Caesar would be that's a Coen Brothers film. We thought that'd be like a good pairing. And we kind of go back and forth and we find like a good match with the guests and we usually come to some agreement. Sometimes we'll suggest movies, sometimes they'll suggest movies. So we have a discussion, we discuss the plot, and then at the end of the film, we will rate the film on a scale of 1 to 5 Jewish stars based on cast and crew, the content, and the underlying themes. We are in a virtual world these days. Harry's in New York and I'm in Seattle, so we record on Zoom. And we've got at 40 episodes out now, and about 3 in post-production. So, and you can get our podcast wherever you get podcasts now.
We just introduced this idea that we rate these films, we talk about their Jewishness, but I'm sure you're wondering, or some of you are wondering, what does that mean? What does it look like for a film to be Jewish? How do you grade that? And the short answer is that's kind of what we're trying to figure out in every episode. We go back and forth and I think come up with some new ideas for, why a particular movie we just watched was more Jewish than another one. But I wanted to help out just by offering 3 different examples of the kinds of Jewishness that we might pull from some of these movies. So if you're familiar with any of these films, this might make some more sense to you, but otherwise, you could take our word for it. But the first one that we listed here is called A Serious Man. That's another Coen Brothers movie. And, that one we wrote is sort of explicit Jewish content. That's a movie that, that embedded into the story itself is a very Jewish character. It's part of the plot. There are instances where he goes to synagogue with his family and his child is learning how to read from the Torah. And there's such clear, explicit Jewish content there. I would call that almost undeniably a Jewish film. The second example that we threw in here is for movies that might not explicitly deal with Jewish content, with Jewish subject, but have this sort of Jewish, we said humor and sensibility to them. So we pulled in a Mel Brooks film. This is Young Frankenstein, although I would say this qualifier can be added on to almost any Mel Brooks film because they all kind of share that. Yeah, because they all share that kind of Jewish tone and sensibility to them. But that's a movie that you can feel the Jewishness of the characters. You can feel Jewishness in the way that they talk and the way that they interact in the world. Oftentimes we'll try to point out if we feel like, you can tell that the filmmaker was Jewish just by watching their movie. And I think that's certainly the case with Young Frankenstein. And then the final category that we just brought in here as an example was we tied it to the movie A Clockwork Orange, which we also discussed on the podcast. And that's a movie that doesn't have any explicit Jewish content you can really point to, and honestly doesn't have so much of this Jewish sensibility, this Jewishness to it. But we were able to have what I thought was a really exciting conversation about it because we spoke about a lot of the themes the movie explores and tied those back to some themes that we've recognized in our own Jewishness and our own Jewish lives. So in that movie in particular, there's a lot of questions of free will and decisions and responsibility and the morality of stripping someone of their free will. And there were plenty of analogs we were able to draw to that movie, so we were able to make the case for that being a thematic Jewish movie.
Yeah, that was an interesting one because we reached out to a film professor in Wales. Part of his thesis with a lot of Kubrick films is finding the Jewishness in all of it, similar to our podcast, but he has written a lot of books about Kubrick's films, and he made a very compelling case for a lot of the symbolism in the Clockwork Orange. So definitely worth checking that episode out. As far as who we've had on the podcast, we've had a number of guests. We started a few episodes at the beginning of our podcast with just me and Harry, but as we've gone on, we found that having a guest on kind of helps with the discussion and the dynamic. So we've had folks from the podcasting world, novelists, writers, critics, producers, actors, things like that. And it's kind of all come through various ways. A lot of it is through social media. So we'll reach out on like film Twitter or Jewish film Twitter, on Instagram through DMs and things like that. And sometimes, like Nabil Ayers is an author of a book, and I got his book at the library in the Seattle Public Library System. I read his book and I was like, oh, this is an amazing story. I would love to discuss your story on our podcast. I emailed him and he reached back out. Another example, like J.D. Lifshitz, I think is a friend of Harry's from childhood. So we emailed them and things like that. Noah Segan, the actor from Knives Out and Glass Onion, things like that. We had on a guest who was a friend of a friend again. And it just one of those things that just kind of works out. All of the guests have come through a lot of different ways, but most people are very open to talking about their favorite movie and kind of discussing it in a new way. So it's been really fun to just explore old movies, new movies, and people's favorite movies with them.
So over the course of, at this point, 40 plus episodes and hopefully and counting, we've come to recognize a number of recurring themes and ideas and just things that we found bridge together a lot of these Jewish films that we've explored that we wanted to share with you. Here, maybe if anyone wants to reach out, throw in some questions in the chat or something, just hear everyone else's thoughts on it and maybe what else you picked up on. But we wanted to highlight some of the stuff that we found ourselves talking about over the course of a couple of different movies. So one of the things that we've really seen across a number of these different movies is this idea of otherness and exploring the immigrant experience and the way that that's kind of mapped into a number of the different Jewish films we've spoken about. And, of course, this is, a lot of these filmmakers and a lot of these films that are born out of, the 20th century Jewish immigrant experience. A lot of Jews, as we know, were immigrating from different countries. They were coming over from Europe and other places, and they really were. They did have this immigrant experience, in America, in the American film system, where they had to learn how to integrate with their opposing faith, with different languages. And a lot of these movies that we've highlighted here really explore that. I mentioned that languages, and one of the movies that I wanted to point to is this Duck Soup on the top left, which was, a comedy that was helmed by the Marx Brothers, a famous Jewish comedic duo. And that's a movie that, although they don't talk about their Jewishness explicitly in context, it's a movie about an outsider coming into a new society and kind of tripping up everyone around them with their language, with their old traditions, with their customs. And this was something that we saw, all the way back then, but even through, modern Jewish tellings, there always is that kind of outsider, or often is that outsider experience that these films are exploring.
It's interesting, just for a little bit of historical context around the founding of like the Hollywood studio system. A lot of the people who started the major studios that we know today were all Jewish immigrants, but early on, in order to sort of fit in and not be an outsider, not be an other, they sought out to tell all these very American stories. It's only until much later, we're talking the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where there's explicit sort of Jewish stories being told to the mainstream for mainstream adoption. And so, yeah, whether, all these are good examples, but there's tons of examples throughout our podcast that come up for sure. I did see a question from friend of the pod and past guest of the pod, Eitan Basri. Hi, Eitan. Have you covered any Israeli films? So we did just cover a movie called Image of Victory, which was about the war of Kibbutz Nitzanim in the late 1940s with Dinah Leffert. So check that episode out. That is our only Hebrew language film to date, but we are open to doing more for sure. Another theme or something that's come up quite a bit with our podcast is this notion of intergenerational trauma and or the Holocaust, because it is something that a lot of Jews had experienced. For instance, in the film The Vigil, which is a horror film from 2019, our protagonist is watching over a dead body and is then haunted by the ghost or a demon who was like a Holocaust survivor. So that plays, into horror genres. We have a drama like The Survivor, which is like the true story of someone who was forced to fight other Jews in concentration camps for the enjoyment of the Nazi guards and things like that. So it's something that comes up quite a bit. And, there's other examples like Young Frankenstein, where it's not as explicit and it's more sort of implied, but it does come up. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll add that, of course, there is the Holocaust connection, which, is it's impossible to kind of untie that from the experience of a lot of these, a lot of Jews and a lot of these filmmakers. But I did want to point out, I think this idea of intergenerational trauma and this kind of shared, history and connection to the past is something that is not only born of the Holocaust, but is also just, fundamental to, I guess, Jewishness, Judaism as a faith of tradition, of continuity, of connection to the past. I mean, that is something that is particular to any people that are joined together in this continued tradition. So it's interesting, even the movies that aren't explicitly about the Holocaust, which I would argue, Young Frankenstein is not. It's interesting to see the way a lot of these filmmakers are grappling with their connection to the past, the connection to their, to their parents, grandparents, and kind of how they can fit in within that, rigid kind of culture of tradition that we find ourselves in.
So in addition to like the sort of broader themes, there's sort of depictions of Jewishness on film. And we're going to talk here about a couple ideas that come up when we're seeing sort of how Jewish people are depicted on film. So this idea is this idea of Jewish coding, right? So oftentimes we'll have characters like in Clueless, we'll have Cher Horowitz, and we'll have in broadcast news, Aaron Altman is his name. So these are ideas of characters who are named Jewishly, but aside from that, it's mostly implied. You have other examples, like in The Long Goodbye, we'll have Elliot Gould playing Philip Marlowe, who we have historically seen, being played by someone like Humphrey Bogart. But, you add in the curly hair and the sort of snarky, sort of quippy retorts to gangsters and things like that, and you sort of assume this Jewishness. And so rather than outright say that they're Jewish, we kind of imply it and we sort of code them as Jewish so that the viewer will understand that.
Yeah, and one thing that, we've encountered this a number of times. There have been movies pitched to us, Broadcast News and Clueless come to mind, where people have suggested these movies as being particularly Jewish. And when it comes to watching it, it's hard to kind of find the explicit Jewish content or the way that they're, talking about their Jewishness or the sensibility. And we've traced it down to this idea of Jewish coding, because even though, Cher Horowitz never discusses her faith as never practicing, any kind of cultural, traditional form of Judaism, there's something undeniable about, her Jewishness, and that's something people have grasped onto. And, we wondered, and this is kind of an open question that we've raised with a number of these, what are filmmakers trying to communicate to their audience by relying on some of these, coded Jewish characters and implying that their characters embody, this existing almost framework for Jewishness. And Daniel, you touched on it. Sometimes it's this snarkiness and this quippiness. It can be a little bit heady. It can be a little bit, of that outsider thing that we were talking about. Some of these characters are often defined by that, but it's just something that, again, we observed through a lot of these movies, the way that they, especially from a particular era, I would say around the 80s and 90s, and part of that can be ascribed to the Jewish filmmakers that were working on a lot of these, but the way that they insert these seemingly Jewish characters into otherwise not so Jewish movies.
Just a couple fun facts. In Clueless, at Cher's house, if you look closely, you will see a mezuzah on her door. But it's interesting that, like, you look at a movie like City Slickers starring Billy Crystal, who we know is Jewish, but in the movie, aside from his, frizzy brown hair and his name, his name is actually not Jewish in this movie. They've sort of stripped it of its Jewishness, and it's only him as this sort of out of place Jew in the Wild West. Again, it's coded. And this is sort of before the era nowadays where everything is very much, how shall I say it? Like, you have movies that very much speak to a particular identity. You have the Moanas of the world, the Encantos of the world, where it's very specifically a different culture, but we're calling it out as that rather than sort of, implying it or things like that. I think back then it wasn't as prevalent to have like explicitly Jewish films, and hopefully that will change. Any questions so far? Any movies come to mind for folks in the audience of any of these themes that we've depicted? Go ahead.
Do you have any more fun facts around characters that we wouldn't have known were Jewish, but I was having a side conversation with someone about how, like, I never would have thought of Cher as Jewish, but like the fact that, like, then I remember like her dad and like,
right.
I love the fun fact of the mezuzah on her house. Like, do you have other fun facts like that about any movie?
Please,
I'll jump in first to address Cher, because she's a really interesting one, because I think that kind of snarky, quippy, kind of coded Jew that we were describing in some of these other characters, that's not really what she embodies. I mean, we discussed the kind of complicated legacy that her as a character leaves on, but is often referred to as kind of the paradigm for this character of the Jap that people refer to, the Jewish American princess, and kind of who that person is. And like you were saying, the daddy's girl and what that role implies. So she's a really interesting example of this kind of Jewish coded character. One, I guess, fun fact about that is this was a film written and directed by Amy Heckerling, and she spoke about how, she was asked about this question, like, were you writing a Jewish character when you told the story of Cher? And she actually said, no, I wasn't really intending her to be Jewish. I don't know if she was aware of the mezuzah, if that was implicitly or placed in her, she did that intentionally. But she said that she was writing something that was true to the world that she was living in California. She was writing about the people that surrounded her, the community she was in. And I think we came to the conclusion when discussing it in that episode that she probably was living in a world of, a lot of Jewish people, and was kind of writing true to her own experience there. So I think that's kind of how that works its way in to her character.
And I think her dad is Dan Hedaya, who's a Syrian Jew. So that's a fun fact about that one. Another sort of controversial issue in the Jewish film world is this idea of non-Jewish actors playing Jewish characters. I think most recently, a comedian like Sarah Silverman brought up the term Jewface when discussing this idea of casting someone like Catherine Hahn as playing Joan Rivers in an upcoming biopic. So here are some examples from films we've covered where we have non-Jewish actors playing Jewish characters. In a movie like Heartburn, we have Nora Ephron and Carl Bernstein being portrayed by Jack Nicholson and Meryl Streep. We have Joe Mantegna in Homicide, directed by David Mamet, as this sort of Jewish detective, sort of torn between his loyalty to his police force and these, fighting anti-Semitic hate groups and things like that. In a movie like School Ties, we have Brendan Fraser, Oscar award-winning Brendan Fraser playing the Jew in this movie. And in fact, of this sort of picture here, I think only Cole Hauser in the top right-hand corner is Jewish. And then in This Is Where I Leave You, we have a set of Jewish siblings coming back home to New Jersey to sit Shiva for their dad. And I think of this entire cast, including Jane Fonda, I think only Corey Stoll is Jewish. So it comes up quite a bit. Yeah.
And I'll add to what you're saying, Daniel. It definitely comes up, this question of who can play who, and kind of the way that these characters are cast. And what we tried to raise with some of these movies is just the different range of what kind of Jewish character you're playing. So in the example of Heartburn, these two actors who are not Jewish are portraying real people that happen to be Jewish. The movie's not really an exploration of anyone's Jewishness. There's not so much Jewishness in there, but it raises the question of, well, when it's a real person, who should you cast? In some of these other examples, like you mentioned, This Is Where I Leave You is about a family coming together to sit Shiva, right? To sell it, to do the ritual funeral practices around their father who's just died. And it's interesting that there's so much discussion of their Jewishness. And, they opted to cast people that weren't necessarily Jewish. And in School Ties, for example, you mentioned Brendan Fraser. That's a movie about someone facing anti-Semitic persecution. It's about him being forced to hide his Jewish identity. And it's a complicated question of, who's playing who and when does it make sense for the role to be Jewish. I wanted to, this is a conversation we've had across a number of these movies where it comes up. And, I just wanted to speak for myself, maybe start the dialogue just about how I feel about them playing it. And I do think that there is space. I think it's fine for people who aren't Jewish, to act as someone who is, even honestly, when it's a real person. If the movie's not an exploration of their Jewishness, it's transformation, it's acting. Right. I think when they're playing a Jewish role, like we alluded to, that, relies on either, real Jewish kind of deep cuts, or possibly even worse, exaggeration, or, prosthetics. And one of the things that that's come up is that there was actually a controversy recently because there's a new movie that's about Leonard Bernstein, and Bradley Cooper's portraying him, and there were pictures of him with a prosthetic nose on to kind of match
a very big nose.
Exactly, and just because of the history of that, and just because of the complications behind, the characterization of Jewish people with, noses, it's become a dicey subject, not trying to weigh in, not trying to tell you what movies, we can or can't watch, but it's an interesting conversation that I think people in the industry are probably having more than they were, in the era of the rest of these films, even This Is Where I Leave You only about 10 years ago.
I mean, we did just record an episode last night about 1948's version of Oliver Twist. For anyone not familiar, do yourself a favor and Google Fagin 1948 Oliver Twist. So Alec Guinness, who most people know as like Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars, plays the evil Jew in that movie Fagin, and he has a huge prosthetic nose and a bunch of other sort of awful features, and that was in 1948. And then you sort of see this. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but it does bring that to mind. And I think maybe Leonard Bernstein might have had like a bigger nose, but I don't know that it's such a good look. And if you think about like authenticity in casting as it exists for other people, it's hard to weigh in like 100% one way or another. I think certainly for me, when there's a Jew who's on film and being portrayed in a not so great light, I think that, it's maybe not such a great look for someone who's not Jewish to be doing that. I think I saw in the chat some talk about Miss Maisel and then also Transparent. I was going to bring up Miss Maisel as like I think the majority of that cast is not Jewish. I think Miss Maisel's ex-husband is Jewish, and then I think his mother and Kevin Pollak, those three folks on the show are Jewish. But it's a little it's a tough subject. I'd be curious to know everyone's thoughts on it, just because, like I said, as we are in 2023, we talk about authentic casting and things like that, and certainly people who get flack for playing roles for races that they are not. A few I feel like Scarlett Johansson played someone, and Emma Stone had played someone in other movies playing races that they were not, and got a lot of flack for that. So yeah, I did see a question.
I wonder if you all have talked about this, but on the note of like, particularly with Mrs. Maisel, like some of the folks that play Jewish characters are Jewish. There's been a lot of written about how the Jewish characters who are played by Jewish actors, they're playing the Jewish characters that are most stereotypically Jewish.
Yeah.
They are like more observant. They are, quite frankly, like shown as being more annoying and more overbearing and more like frustrating to be around and like more cheap. Like they're all of the Jewish stereotypes. And the people that are Jewish but are played by non-Jewish actors are like breaking all the stereotypes, and they're not stereotypical Jewish. And there's been some great pieces written about how that's actually pretty typical of what we see in all types of media, that Jewish characters who are played by Jewish actors are very stereotypically Jewish in a bad way. And Jewish characters who are played by non-Jewish actors get to just like be themselves at time, and they're shown as like the quote unquote good Jew. And I'm wondering if y'all have talked about that.
I mean, I think certainly with like a film or with a show like Maisel, everything is like very heightened. I enjoy both Jewish media and I enjoy comedy, but there are certain times in Maisel episodes where I was just like, this is too much. Like, this is too much. It's like very extra Jewish and like very shticky and like over the top. And I do feel like, yeah, her family, especially, her dad, he does a great job. Tony Shalhoub, he comes up a lot, as does John Turturro, as like in our Mount Rushmore of people who often play Jews who are not Jews. They come up quite a bit. His character's kind of grounded, but yeah, Midge Maisel is very kind of over the top. Yeah, I don't know. Harry, I want to see if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that trend, as you're describing, is definitely troubling. When it's just we'll use the Jewish actor, but only because we want to exaggerate it. It reminds me of a conversation that we have had in the past on the podcast about representation and how we always applaud Jewish representation in film. And one of the most exciting things about the podcast is finding these movies that either we didn't consider were Jewish or even that we hadn't heard of, and just seeing how much Jewish representation there is. But one of the really exciting things is when you see Jewish characters or Jewish actors or some combination, but they're not playing the typical Jew. They're not playing, what we call the tokenized Jew, which we're going to talk about in a later slide. And they're actually just, even if they're the villain in the story, even if they're, just doing something adjacent, there's something really exciting about, witnessing Jewish representation where the Jewishness is a part of their identity, but not their defining exaggerated feature, and they're not used for their Jewishness in that kind of tokenized way. I wanted to move us to our next slide.
Sure. Sure.
Really, after some of those maybe heavier topics and questions that come up in the podcast, one of the most fun exercises that we do is, especially in part of that, we spoke about finding movies that are thematically Jewish. So one of the exercises we often try to do with our podcast are, reach in with these maybe biblical touchstones. Sometimes we'll argue whether or not they were intended by the filmmaker. Sometimes we acknowledge that we're kind of just working them in, but we look for, the Jewish influence, the sort of thematic stretches that might show up in some of these movies. So we wanted to explore first some Jewish structural biblical touchstones, and then go into some of those stretches that we've kind of pulled out, and, just go through the exercise that we sometimes do on the podcast.
Yeah. If anyone has listened to the podcast, you know how I love my stretches. So I'm excited to talk about them.
So one thing, and we like I said, we have these biblical allusions. We often try to trace a lot of these narrative stories to their biblical antecedents. Like I said, sometimes we're kind of working them in because we're watching with a Jewish lens, and we want to see how can we kind of incorporate this into our tradition. But also there are these frameworks and story structures that have existed, in the Torah itself, and obviously in a lot of the Jewish stories that we've told, that we think are, oftentimes intentionally or not, kind of weighing on the story structure and sometimes the events of the story that make their way into a lot of these Jewish films. So one thing that we've really seen a number of times is, this sort of Job-like character. And, very loosely, the story of Job is, what you got to know is that this character who's kind of made to suffer continuously by, this sort of divine punishment before eventual redemption. And this conversation has happened with a number of these different movies, which if you're familiar with any of them, you'll hopefully recognize what we're saying, because we have these characters that are just constantly suffering. And when you think things can't get worse. It's the next new twist happens. And to the point that I think in a lot of these cases, it almost starts to feel divine, like something is weighing in to stop them from reaching the goal. And then by the end, in some cases there's redemption. In some cases, they're made to suffer even more. But we've used this story of Job to kind of understand and view these movies. And in some cases, I think if you spoke to, the Safdie brothers, the directors of Uncut Gems, I would be surprised if they, would say that they weren't familiar with that story when kind of creating the world that they did in their film Uncut Gems.
Yeah, and I think these analogies work out really well sometimes, right? Like in a movie like Booksmart, they have their mission is to get to a party at the end of the night, but they are hit by a number of setbacks and a lot of hilarity ensues and things like that. But eventually they get to the party, they have fun, and they graduate high school, and they live happily ever after. In other stories, like After Hours, A Serious Man, and Uncut Gems, things don't always work out well, and they don't always find redemption like they do in the Job story. So sometimes it's just a little bit about using the Job framework to kind of talk a little bit about the structure. So for things that don't quite fit the bill 100%, again, my favorite section, the stretches, right? So with the idea of the stretches is sort of this creative exercise to think a little bit more broadly and talk about something, just sort of an idea that comes to mind that doesn't always have to be exactly what the filmmaker intended, but like something that just popped into your head and like, oh, here's a silly idea. Let me talk it out. Like you're watching the movie Hail Caesar and you have Hobie Doyle here, portrayed by a Jew, Alden Ehrenreich. He's a stuttering cowboy star who wants to then, move over to melodramas. And so the stretch that came to mind for me was that he's like a Moshe character, a Moses character with his speech impediment, and he's sort of an outsider Jewish character. And sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes it's a little bit of a stretch. So, we call it, when we see it, we say, let's get on the stretch train. Let's just keep that in mind as we're discussing this topic. It is a stretch. It may not be exactly what the Coen brothers intended. In other examples, we have Enemies, a Love Story, which is a story about a Holocaust survivor who, by the end of the film, is married to 3 different women through various circumstances. Angelica Houston is his wife from when before the war. He thought she was dead. She comes back. He has his non-Jewish, I guess she works with him, and then he marries her, and then he has his mistress on the side. And so one of the stretches I talked about in the episode was that the women in his life represent his past, his present, and his future. And sort of talking about that, again, not as Paul Mazursky intended, but just kind of a loose idea. Harry, are there any stretches that you are particularly passionate about that you want to share with our audience?
So I wanted to mention one we have up there, The Big Lebowski, and hopefully some of you are familiar with that movie, and this kind of makes sense. And we're underselling. We're saying that maybe they weren't intended, but I don't know. I think we might have unlocked something.
Okay, so, I'll buy it.
And you can listen more, and this is all obviously to encourage you to listen to these episodes, check out the podcast so you can get it more in context. But if you are familiar with the film, there's this iconic dream sequence in the middle of it, and it kind of represents a turning point in the movie. And we made the case that it's almost this rebirth for the character, right? For the dude, the main character in the movie is undergoing this rebirth. And in the very first sequence after he's reborn, so to speak, he's chased around by these men holding these scissors. So might be a stretch, might be pushing it. We kind of created, maybe there's this allusion to circumcision, and maybe this isn't just a rebirth. This is, a Jewish male rebirth that he's undergoing, and this is kind of setting up the next stage of the movie. And I can't see reactions, so I don't know how many of you are, rolling your eyes or smiling along. But this is just one of the fun. This is one of the fun exercises we do. And I see a comment about the dude's sidekick not rolling on Shabbos. We are going to cover that very soon. He's one of that movie and that character are some of the favorite people that we've gotten to cover on this podcast. So we will get into that very soon.
So you may be asking yourself, you have 40 plus episodes, you've just heard us talk, and you want to know kind of where to get started. I think one thing to do is to kind of look through the episodes, find a movie that you're familiar with, that you're passionate about, that you're interested in hearing discussed. We always say that it is nicer to kind of watch the movie in advance. But if you know you know, if you know a little bit about the movie, that's enough. You can also listen to the episode first and then do the movie, but either works. So I just wanted to talk about three of my sort of favorite episodes. It's hard to pick your favorites, you know, like much like your kids, it's hard to pick your favorites, but I'm going to attempt of our 40 episodes to pick three that were kind of unique episodes. But always all the episodes are great because most of the time I'm watching films for the first time. And if not, I'm kind of watching it, you know, I'm watching The Big Lebowski specifically through a Jewish lens, which I had not done up until that point. So After Hours it's sort of a zany Martin Scorsese movie, and it's about the 1980s in downtown Manhattan with a sort of uptown yuppie guy who goes downtown to kind of have fun for one night. And we had Nabil Ayers on, who kind of was a touring musician, and he grew up and around up in that art scene in the 80s, and so he added a lot of context to that. We talked about Enemies: A Love Story with a film critic from Portland who had interviewed Paul Mazursky on a number of occasions, so he had a lot of extra context to add to the film and kind of was helpful in framing the film in terms of its timing and what Mazursky had in mind, and ultimately why the film did not do very well at the box office, but is, you know, well regarded in the film community. And then we also talked, one of my other favorites, we talked with Sonia Sanford, who's a chef and a home cook and things like that, about Heartburn, which is Nora Ephron's personal like memoir that they then turned into a movie. So all of the conversations have been really, really fun. And Harry, what about yourself? Do you have any favorites?
Yeah, I've got a couple that I want to mention.
Sure.
You know, one of them that I was really excited to highlight was The Exorcist. That was a movie that, you know, it was a little bit of a surprising pick at first because it's a very religious Catholic film about exorcism, you know, which, as far as I'm familiar, is not a Jewish practice, or there's no Jewish version of it. But
Right.
It was really interesting. What I found in discussing this movie is that, and this is something that I've always known about watching these very religious films, is that, you know, sometimes I'm able to connect more in terms of my Jewishness with, you know, these Christian films or these Catholic films or these films belonging to another religion, just because they're exploring some of these similar themes of and questions of faith and belief and, you know, sacrifice and struggle. And it's so interesting to see the way that a movie, even from another perspective, I can find a lot of shared interest in. So that was a really exciting discussion we had. The other one I wanted to spotlight was Dirty Dancing, which was a movie that I was, you know, I'd heard of. I was familiar with the big climactic dance scenes, and I'd heard the way people had spoken about it, but never had heard anyone refer to it in a Jewish context. And
Yeah.
until I watched it, I might not have expected to, but it's really about this, you know, Jewish retreat, and it's so, there's so much Jewishness in there. We had an amazing guest who was really knowledgeable about what those retreats looked like, and, you know, was really informative on kind of what shaped that movie, and it cast this movie in a new light I did not expect to watch it in. And then finally, I put The Big Lebowski in here, one of the most Jewish movies. Yeah, one of the most Jewish and fun ones we did. You know, there was a comment earlier about the character of Walter. He's very famous for his "I don't roll on Shabbos" line. I'll admit, when we tell people about this podcast, they often like to pitch movies to us, and Big Lebowski probably comes up more than any. But what I thought was so fascinating about it, he wasn't just this funny side character, you know, with his Jewishness, but he actually was a really interesting character that related to his Jewishness in terms of a little bit of the way that he was bound by law. And it was about how he couldn't, you know, he couldn't roll on Shabbos, right? He wasn't able to do things because he considered himself confined to, you know, the strictures of his religion. And I just thought, especially compared to like what we mentioned earlier, a lot of the tokenized depiction of Jews that you see sometimes in mainstream Hollywood films, you'll often see them lighting the Hanukkah candles, or you'll see them, you know, sitting down for a Shabbos meal. And it was really interesting to see a movie that explored, you know, the other side of Jewishness that you often don't see explored by these movies. So that was a really exciting one for us to cover.
As far as like the future of our podcast, you know, as we continue to make new episodes and things like that, we have been making sort of adjustments along the way. It's kind of an iterative thing. You know, we change our format. And one of the things we're doing now is we shift to doing episodes every 2 weeks. We both work full time, and I have a family and stuff like that. And Harry's got a life outside of work and podcasts. And so we want to be mindful of that, because it is for us an extra thing, like a really fun creative project, but we don't want it to be like something that burns us both out. So we're trying to do that. We're growing our audience organically through social media and things like that. And, I'd love to down the line eventually come out with a, Jews on Film guide to movies, so we can kind of put this into a nice coffee table book that you can read on Shabbat at your leisure. And maybe we could even make some popcorn or something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I like that idea. Like you said, we are growing. We have about 150 or so average episode listeners, but it's nice to see the way it continues to grow. We get good word of mouth. We've been able to get, a couple articles written about the podcast, and we've gotten some really exciting guests. And we hope that it just continues to grow. And like you said, it's not our main focus. It's a little bit of this kind of fun thing on the side. But as far as right now, I'm really enjoying doing this. So as long as we continue to enjoy it, I think this is something we're going to keep growing as best as we can.
Yeah, just wanted to speak kind of to the multimedia aspect of the title of our session. We do have accounts on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter, on YouTube, Facebook, and things like that. And so what we'll do is, because our podcast is primarily an audio medium, I think in order to get people interested and engaged and things like that, we will create like short video snippets featuring like a nice moment from the episode, and we will tag our guests, and they can kind of help amplify our content out to their networks and introduce things to people. And it's very interesting that, I'm still sort of new to the TikTok of it all, but I think it's very interesting seeing how videos perform across different platforms to different audiences. Some videos will do super well on TikTok and not so well on Instagram, and then various other videos will do super well on Instagram. And I'm learning all the time about this kind of stuff. #AlwaysBeLearning. But we are constantly trying to figure out what works best for our audience and what sort of clips and things like that. And we kind of iterate with our video process. You can check us out at Jews on Film Pod on Twitter, Jews on Film Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and our Linktree. Does anyone have any questions?
Is Star Wars Jewish?
Is Star Wars Jewish? Oh, go ahead, Harry.
That came up in an episode once. We were talking about our stretches and our themes, and someone's like, well, you can make any movie Jewish. You can talk about Star Wars. But then they proceeded to make a really good case for, the light side and the dark side. They were talking about, the evil inclination, the good inclination, the kind of battle, the war between different sides of, being good versus being bad. So I think there's a reach you can make for any movie, but I actually think there's more to that movie than most. You could really, maybe we'll cover it on a future episode.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, I think the desert, we have a history of being desert people, kind of wandering the desert and things like that. So moving structures, kind of like the sand crawler. You got me thinking, Rebecca. I do like that idea quite a bit. Maybe you could come on and discuss it with us.
People also awesome. Say that Yoda's, like the way that Yoda speaks is the same syntax as Hebrew.
Oh, okay.
So.
All right.
Okay. Another question.
Yeah.
What actors would people be surprised to learn are Jewish, and which actors would people be surprised to learn aren't Jewish?
That's a great question. It kind of depends. I think, like I was saying, I think the actors who most people assume are Jewish, I think like a lot of people, John Turturro has played a lot of different ethnicities. He's one of them that shows up. He plays Jesus in The Big Lebowski, but he's also played Jewish before. I think Miss Maisel's dad, whose name escapes me right this second, but I think he's Lebanese. He often plays Jewish. I'm trying to think of the inverse though. Like Hobie Doyle from Hail Caesar, I did not think was a Jew. So that was kind of surprising. I don't know, Harry, do you have any good ones?
Yeah, easier, it's easier to think of the ones that are not Jewish that, you'd be surprised because of the way that they play Jewish characters. But, every episode, that's a part of each of the episodes is when we go and rate the film, right? We mentioned this kind of scale of 1 to 5 stars. Often we'll look at the cast and crew, the content, who was Jewish and was their character supposed to be Jewish, right? In some cases, they're playing a character like, Jesus, like you mentioned, and maybe in that context they wouldn't be, but I don't know, right. Specific.
I'll take a moment to plug our Shabbat Shalom question of the week, because this was a question that we had. And the reason we had this question is because I found out that Daniel Radcliffe was Jewish.
Oh, okay.
And I wanted to know who else was Jewish that we wouldn't know, and I personally learned that Harrison Ford was Jewish.
Oh yeah, right.
Which I did not know. Another one for Star Wars.
There you go.
But I'm always personally looking for which celebrities are and aren't Jewish, because and like somebody thought Weird Al was Jewish, but he's not.
Nope. Yeah, Seth Meyers. Yeah, +1 for that. Tim Blake Nelson. You know, he just wrote a book, so we're trying to get him on the podcast. And if you're a fan of Poker Face, he was great in that. Yeah, Harrison Ford. Yeah, who else? Let's see. Yeah, I think Hanukkah Song is a good way to find out for folks. Scarlett Johansson, very cool.
What is your favorite movies? Both for both of you, what's your favorite movie generally? Like, not necessarily do at the podcast, but just like your favorite. You only can watch one movie for the rest of your life. Like, what movie is that?
Oh boy. I often cite Magnolia as one of my favorite movies. It's kind of a longer movie, so I don't know that I'd be like so happy watching it all the time. I think it's like 3.5 hours long, but it's by Paul Thomas Anderson, and it has a number of great performances in the film with like John C. Reilly and Tom Cruise and Philip Seymour Hoffman. So that one is for me. Is we might cover it on a future episode. We'll see, but I don't know. How about you, Harry?
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. I know the I don't know if I have one for like the comfort food kind of always return to movie, but I have always cited that movie Memento, that Christopher Nolan movie, which I don't know if it's Jewish, but it does play with time and structure a lot, and I'm sure we can find an analog in the Torah to that. But that was a movie that I just really enjoyed and kind of got me really into a lot of this. So that's one that I always cite, the movie Memento. I saw there was a question asked about the movie You People, which is one that we have thought about discussing. We've spoken to some people about kind of entering into the dialogue with that movie, and we're definitely not against discussing movies that might have either controversial or, in this case that I haven't seen it yet, so I can't speak to it, but possibly a negative portrayal. But that is, that's an evolving conversation we're having about, how Jewish some of these movies are. So we might cover that one in the future. I would say stay tuned for it.
I do feel like we probably need to have I think like, I'd want to be able to like discuss that movie from like a balanced perspective and not just two white guys talking about You People. I feel like, we would want somebody, we're talking to a few guests who can kind of help discuss it more equally and kind of, have a good discussion about it, I think. So look out for that in the future soon. But yeah, if there's any like future movies you'd like us to cover, if you have any thoughts, please light up the chat and let us know. But if not, thank you so much, everyone, for listening to us, in this presentation, and hopefully check out the podcast and let us know. And, we're on all the social media, so check us out and have a good one. And Shabbat Shalom. Jews on Film is hosted and produced by Harry Ottensasser and Daniel Zana. Daniel and Harry edited this episode. Make sure to follow us on Instagram @JewsOnFilm and subscribe to our podcast to get new episodes. Thanks for listening.